everybody, and welcome back to the Skift Travel Podcast. I'm Skift's editor-in-chief, Sarah Kopit, joined as always by Skift's head of research, Seth Borko. Hey, Seth, how you doing?
Good. How you doing, everybody?
Good. So today we're really excited. We're joined by Erik Blachford to talk about how to become a travel industry CEO. So as a founding member of the team over at Expedia, he was the CEO there, and at Terrapass and Butterfield and Robinson, which is a high-end adventure travel outfit. And I'm so curious to talk to you a little bit about that. I wrote a piece about that not too long ago, and that is just a fascinating space. So before we get into it, though, quick reminder, send all of your questions, comments, anything you might have to podcasts@skift.com. We will read them on the air and get you those answers. And please don't forget to follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. And if you're enjoying the show, please rate us 5 stars, leave a positive review so we can spread the word about the Skift Travel Podcast. So, Erik, back to you. Can you kind of break down for us? You've had a long career, long history in the C-suite at travel outfits. You have worked in this industry. You've seen what it takes to kind of operate at the highest level at a travel company. Can you give us a little bit of the inside baseball, a little bit of what it takes to actually be the CEO of a travel company and a business, like even from the small ones to something as big as Expedia?
Okay, that's a question. Well, first of all, hi, Sarah. Hi, Seth.
Hi.
Yeah, well, sure, we can dive right in. I guess sure. So the common thread on any time you've got responsibility at a travel company, really what you've got is you got responsibility for people. You got responsibility for the way that they're going to spend their days at probably for a lot of people, either the most precious time of the day of their year, if it's a vacation, or it can be some of the most vital times of the year if they're on really important business travel. So it depends. And of course, we all know that leisure travel and business travel are pretty different things. But ultimately, if you're going to take responsibility for people's travel, you're taking responsibility for an important part of their lives. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Now, that's true of lots of different industries, but in travel, it's really visceral, right? Because we all know what it's like when something goes wrong. And so you have this huge premium on things not going wrong. And that can mean very different things for different people. So if you're at a tech-enabled company like Expedia, what you have to make sure is that, as an example, that you're very product focused. You want the rates and availability to come back, and not, the deadly thing in early days of Expedia, for instance, would be maybe you would have rates that would come up, and then someone would go to book them, and the rate would change. It made people mental. And so you have to put because your business there is that, travel is kind of a call and response business, right? When it comes to booking, you sort of say, here's what I want. And then you get your options back, and you have to get them right. Whereas something like Butterfield Robinson, which is a very high-end active travel company that mostly does bike tours, where I was the CEO for a few years, was quite different there. Because actually, price, wasn't quite so important. What was, though, really important was these little tiny touches, these little wow moments that the guides could get in front of people. And it sounds sort of silly to say, but it's stuff like you wake up in the morning and your water bottle is already on your bike and it's filled with water, and by the way, bottled water too, right? And it's the sort of thing where, okay, that's a completely different thing. So, when the whole travel journey from the moment that you think you're going to book to the moment you get on your bike or you're checking into your hotel, that becomes your responsibility if you're going to sit on top of a travel company. And of course, travel company sort of encompasses so many different things, from booking all the way through the actual travel experience, that it can be any of those things and all of those things.
Which one did you find? I mean, they're really different.
Really different.
The tech stack versus, kind of essentially luxury, personalization of travel. Which one was harder?
Oh, okay. Which one was harder? They were both pretty hard in their ways. The Butterfield Robinson experience, you feel really bad when someone has been let down because their expectations are very high. And if there's human error involved, of course, you feel bad just the way you would if, companies like that, it's almost like you've told your friend, you're taking your friends out on a trip.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, guys, oh, wait, and you spent months building up. There's this incredible little cafe in Pouligny-Morachet in Burgundy. We're going to bike. It's going to be amazing. And Monsieur's going to be there for us. And you get there and it's like closed for renovation. You're like,
Right.
oh, no. Whereas, of course, if something goes wrong at a bigger company, yeah, you might be a step removed from people because there's the tech stack, but I'm sure you get a situation where, oh, I don't know, there's a data breach or something, and you feel just as much responsibility, right? And so
Yeah.
I don't know that you can say one is harder than the other. One is certainly more visceral than the other.
Right. Yeah. No, I can totally see that.
I mean, one is probably a lot more around maybe structures and processes, and one is maybe a little more like interpersonal. Like, I mean, what is that true, or is it all still pretty the same skill set, like as a CEO? You know what I mean?
Well, certainly when it comes to the customer base, that might be true. But I think when it comes to the day-to-day function, I mean, the truth is, the CEO is a cliche, but the CEO is a leadership position. I mean, really, you shouldn't try to get into the CEO business or really the leadership business if you don't like dealing with people. If you don't like, I mean, I guess you can talk about, oh, you have to like managing people. But when you're up at that level, it's not so much that you're managing people. What you're trying to do is support people as they try to get done what they need to get done in the day. I mean, it's interesting. As I sort of transitioned from doing day-to-day management as a CEO into doing more kind of independent board work,
Yeah.
which, I was the exec chairman way back at Couchsurfing. I mean, I've done a big variety of different kinds of travel businesses there too. I find after a while, we all do this thing, right? Where we sit down and we say, okay, I assume everybody does this, periodically you think, what do I really want to, what makes me tick here? What color is my
Yeah.
parachute, right? You sort of do
Yeah.
that thing. And after a while you realize, like, if you're going to sit on boards and enjoy it, if you're going to be in the C-suite, you have to like seeing people succeed. Like, that has to be the honest thing that you really like. And you have to become a kind of a coach. And I would say that a CEO, especially at a bigger company, is kind of almost a player coach, where of course you're in
Yeah.
there, and the spotlight, the headlines goes to the big strategic decisions, which of course always get kind of labeled onto the CEO. And actually, there are a bunch of CEOs who are quite hands-on on strategic things, and that is a lot of fun to think about. But really, most of the job is making sure that everybody else has got what they need to get their jobs done as well as they can. Right. Now, when you're in a very small company, the balance tilts a little more towards player and away from coach. But I think that's sort of obvious.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes perfect sense. I would love if we could get maybe, if possible, like a little more like concrete. Like, what is, like, when you were the CEO of Expedia and you'd come in on a Monday morning, like what does a CEO actually do? I think we see them on CNBC, we see them, these titans of industry, they're on TV, and we know it's a leadership role, we know it's about mentoring, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah. What's 11 a.m. on a Tuesday look like?
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're in a meeting. You can ask me any time between 8 and 6 any day of the week, and I can answer that pretty easily. You're probably in a meeting. I mean, one of the things that is just true of any sort of C-suite job, but especially a CEO, is a huge part of your job is being visible. And being visible tends to mean you're in meetings. And anybody who's running a somewhat structured operation, what you're going to do is you're going to have regular one-on-one meetings with your direct reports. And by the way, these days it's a little complicated too, because some of the stuff is remote, some of the stuff is in person. It depends on the company, it depends on the vendors and so on. Basically, what you're doing is you're being visible to your direct reports one-on-one, to your staff as a group, and that again on some regular cadence. And you and your office are the ones really responsible for making sure that it feels as though there's a kind of an operating system for the business. What is the cadence that you're setting with your direct reports, with your staff, that you expect them to set with their direct reports and their staff? What are the meetings around key strategic points or tactical points in the business that you show up at those meetings? I mean, partly it's because your opinion matters, but a lot of the time you're not the most informed person in the room. What you're there to do is make sure everybody understands that this is, in fact, an important thing, and this decision can get made in this room. So a lot of this, you're sort of showing up so that things don't get slowed down, waiting for you to show up. Does that make sense?
Right.
And so
Yeah,
visibility becomes a kind of an important part of the job, but you're really there to allow the other people who really know what they're talking about to get the decision made without having to then go and run it by you. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that CEOs end up in an enormous number of meetings where on paper you might say they're the decision maker. They're really there more to say, I agree that this decision can hold and go forward, and so it
right.
doesn't slow things down.
I'm
There's probably a
curious, you
lot of
brought
CEOs who are like, dude, I do more than that. But
maybe it's the sign of a good CEO, right?
Yeah.
Because
nobody
recognizing that
knows.
you maybe aren't the one with the most information. But I am curious though, you brought up remote work and hybrid work and how everything has changed in the last 4 years since the pandemic. I'm curious to get your take on that as somebody in the C-suite. I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know, I guess anecdotal talk on, on in that you'll read in the media that most people in management or executives want folks back in the office, and workers, quite frankly, do not. We are at Skift; we're fully remote, so that is our reality. What is your take on that?
My opinion is that either one can work and can work really well, but you have to
Yeah.
decide which one you're going to do. And I think the murky middle
Oh,
is the difficult thing. So I'm still on the board of Zillow,
yeah.
which was founded by Rich Barton and Lloyd Frank, like Expedia guys. And we are Cloud HQ. We are completely remote. It's a big company, several thousand employees spread out all over the place. And during the pandemic, the team just made the decision. Look, we need to either go all remote or we need to have a path back to in person. And it gets into the nuts
Hmm.
and bolts of real estate leases and all the rest of it. So they went fully remote, and it's been great. It's worked really, really well.
Yeah.
And I think it's largely because people know where they stand. They're not remote thinking, should I move to the outlying town where life might be better, but not really knowing if 6 months from now they're going to start asking me to come to work 4 days a week. So once you made that
Right.
decision, once you've cut the cord, which I think sounds like it's true for you guys, that can work really, really well. And also, I'm on the board of a company that does home energy management up in Montreal called Decibel. Well, that's a hardware company. We install a box in your garage that connects your solar panels and your electric vehicle, and et cetera. Lots of software in there too. Anyway, that's a very
Yeah.
engineering intensive thing. It would be extremely difficult to do that company remote. Now, you could have some parts of the
Mm,
company remote, right? Some of the salespeople could be, but the engineers not remote. But that doesn't feel right. And so, no, it makes more sense for that company to not be remote, to be back in the office every day. And that works great too, because everybody's like, great, we understand. And so, I was saying before, like, part of the CEO job is to establish the operating system for the company. This is another pretty good example of that, where it's like, that probably is a decision that at some level you take all the different inputs and so on, and your CEO is going to be the one who sort of says at the end of the day, okay, I've heard everything. We put it all together. This seems like the right thing. I bless this decision. And then repeat. But that's the other thing about being a CEO is you really have to repeat yourself a lot, right? I mean, that's a
yeah.
huge part of the job, is just making sure that everybody is hearing the same thing over and over and over again. And I would say the remote work
And
thing
it's
falls in
hard.
that for sure.
It's hard to do.
Yes.
You'd think it would be
It
easy to
is.
repeat yourself over and over and over, but it's harder than one might guess, right?
Yes, in fact, it sounds like you have some experience with this, right? It's very important, and I mean, we're seeing this right now. I mean, it's an election year, and so we are seeing the power of repetition. I mean, there's a reason the stump speech is exactly the same every time, and the news clips are always the same,
Yeah.
because you're trying to get your message across. So we all know from advertising and everything else, it takes at least 3 or 4 times hearing something. In a big company, how many times are you actually going to see the CEO speak? Well, the CEO, you got to make sure you're just dead consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious, when you've either been hired or hired people, been on the board or the hiring committee to hire people into C-suite roles, I'm curious if you can run through what that process looks like, or maybe even how it's different than, a lower level or a more junior person. And do you always use an executive search firm when you're looking for a CEO, or is that something that is it done by word of mouth? Like, can you walk us through how that works on a kind of a practical basis?
Yeah, I mean, so my direct experience with CEO searches has almost always been internal. So
Mm,
very, very often, what you'll have is a situation where you've got at least one, sometimes some. If you're lucky, you've got more than one internal candidate. And then what you'll do is you'll go outside and it depends very much on the scale of the company here, but if you're at any kind of scale, realistically, yeah, you're going to use an executive recruiter. I mean, it's just going to make sense because
Yeah.
very few companies maintain a big database of all the external people who would be good to come in and potentially be the CEO. It doesn't make sense as a resource allocation, right? No one's really going to do that, and that's what the executive recruiters do. So there's a very practical reality there. But I would also say that part of a good management structure. I mean, the times when I've seen it make most sense to pull someone in from outside are the times when something has gone not according to plan internally. So most
Yeah.
companies, most of the time, right, the plan should be grow your talent internally, find the person who's ready to take over for the CEO at the time when the CEO is ready to move on. But we actually just did this at Zillow last week. Rich Barton stepped aside, Jeremy Waxman steps in. That's been, I mean, I'm on the board there. That's been in the making for a long time. Jeremy's been the chief operating guy for 3 years, et cetera. Now, just to pick up from my own experience, in 2009, when I went to become the CEO at Butterfield Robinson, well, we were coming out of a financial crisis, and it was very chaotic in high end travel. I don't know if you guys remember, but it was like one of the few times, even at the high end, all the wallets slammed shut for a while, and there were big
Yeah.
layoffs, including the person who had been running the company. And there was just nobody there internally who could have taken it on. And so I got the call because, well, it's funny, most people don't realize the reason I got that call actually is because when I was a kid right out of college, I was a guide for Butterfield Robinson. I was one of the people filling the water bottles. So they knew that I
That's
had
fantastic.
since then I had done the Expedia gig and so on. They thought, oh, okay, well, let's. And so I ended up on the radar screen, which was really pretty amusing. But again, in those situations where you don't have the obvious internal candidate, yeah, executive recruiter ends up being the thing that makes the most sense to do by far. I mean, I know there's for jobs that are more functional, it is more realistic to say, okay, we can probably fill that job based on our networks. Let's go out. We'll use LinkedIn and so on. And I think that's sort of a numbers game. I mean, if you're looking for a good sales engineer, say, well, there's a lot of sales engineers out there, and a lot of your sales engineers will already know a lot of other people who are pretty good, and the referral network thing does make some sense. It's kind of different when you're talking about somebody who can actually run the company as the CEO. First of all, there aren't
Yeah.
that many, but also the networking is completely different because it's sort of quasi-competitive at the same time.
I'm curious what those qualities are, and that makes it so rare to find people who could be or would be successful at being a C-suite leader or a CEO. Like, what do you have to have, like, in your person to really run a company, any company, a travel company? Um, what do you think that special magic combination of qualities are?
Well, so I'm going to put my board hat, investor hat on here
Yeah.
because it's funny. After a while, this is the sort of thing you start to look for it in founders, but also you look for it in functional CEOs. Of course, it's a combination of things. I would say so. We've already talked about communication skills and how important that is. We've talked about people skills, how important that is, and I would expand that into if you're a CEO and you're not interested in HR, if you're like, oh well, HR that can work for somebody else, I'm like, you're probably not my kind of CEO. Like you should care a lot about stuff
Right.
like compensation. Like that should really matter a lot to you because the most important thing you've got are the people who are going to actually run the engine. But beyond that, I would say it's really important as the CEO to have at least one of the functional areas in the company has to be something that you are deeply curious about, deeply invested in, has to feel like the domain that if you weren't the CEO, that's where you'd be playing and you'd be really happy. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I laugh. I mean, I use myself as an example. I mean, my Instagram feed is filled with, I follow all these folks who are like the best ads of all time, print ads, TV ads.
Mm,
And I scroll and I watch I love watching really good 30-second ads. I think about the product. I think about, oh, that's kind of cool. Okay. I see what they're doing there. I like the funny ones. I like the other ones. Well, I understand not everyone does that, right? I'm a dyed in the wool
right.
consumer marketing and product guy, and so I know that
Right.
about myself. I'll give you a great example, sort of in the travel business, right? In the hospitality business, there are really great hospitality CEOs who have come up through food and beverage, And there are really great CEOs who've come up through real estate, and there's really great CEOs who've come up through the whole tech stack and reservation world and all that, right? More the sort of the marketing side of things. Any of those can be completely effective as a CEO over the whole hotel company. But it's really important that one of those is close to their heart and that they care a lot about it, because that's their way into the organization.
What do you think about switching things? Because I think that there's some organizations where it's like, this is a CFO to CEO organization. I feel like some organizations sometimes say, oh yeah, our CFO is going to be the next CEO. And some say our chief product officer is going to be the next CEO. There's some like product-led, finance-led, marketing-led organizations. Sometimes we see companies switch and they say, oh, the former executive was the finance guy. Now we're bringing in a new executive who's the marketing guy or girl. Obviously, I should have said used multiple examples, but like, does that mean that sets the tone for the culture? I think a lot of times, is that a challenging transition for a company, or can it work?
Well, it could work, but challenging is certainly the word. I mean, it's there's some great Steve Jobs quote about what happens when you put finance people in charge of a product and marketing company, and I'm not going to get it right, but I think it probably we can all guess more or less what it was. That's the dangerous move, I would say. In all of my experiences, when you've got a company that really thrives on delivering a product and a product experience to customers in a way that really gets them fired up. And I mean, Apple is it's such the obvious example. It's sort of the cliche. I would say even like little Butterfield Robinson is not a bad example. Like people really wait to get the catalogs and find out what are the new trips. I mean, the customers have been going for a long time. It really matters to them to find out. Oh, B&R is going to Croatia now. This is great. That sort of thing. Or I was on the board at Liftopia, the ski lift ticket company, and people would get very excited when the ability to sort of book things 3 days in advance came out, or whatever, or tie it to the weather forecast. I don't know. If you put a finance person in charge of that company, a lot of the time, unless it's a pretty special individual, they won't really understand why the extra money is going through what doesn't even have to be a formal R&D line on the P&L, right? Research and development. It could just be that there's a bunch of time and energy being spent on innovation that just doesn't make sense to someone who is used to looking at everything through the lens of numbers. And so I think that's just danger right there. And I think that's played out in business. That's not a travel thing. That's played out in business over and over again. I think I could make an argument that there's the airline industry certainly has gone down that path multiple times. There's been cycles where everybody in charge is mostly caring about much more about dollars and cents and about customer experience, and then somebody comes around and says, "Wait, customer experience," and the whole thing flips on its head again, and it cycles around. A little less in hospitality, I think, but I do think making those changes is always a little bit at your peril. And going the other way too, by the way, a company that needs to be run really as a tight ship that puts somebody in charge who's used to making, the big bets, be it in marketing or whatever else it might be. I mean, like right now, you put the person who's ready to make the big bet on AI, but actually this company has run like a railroad for years and years and years. You might get a little bit nervous about that.
So there's an important, I guess, like cultural fit element. I'm a bit of a numbers guy, a bit of a finance guy, so I'm thinking I'm sure I could. It's not as bad as you make it sound, but I think there are actually a lot of companies that I'm calling out. I think Disney sort of ran into that issue a little bit too, where they put the CFO in charge and it didn't go so great.
Oh, it happens a lot. And of course, what you're looking for a lot of the time is the twinning of the CEO and the CFO. I mean, if you get the right two people in those two boxes, you almost end up with a sort of inside person, outside person to some extent. I mean, there's lots of different ways of moving it around. I mean, it is worth saying the CEO is not an island, right? I mean, unless you're at a very small company, the CEO needs to be supported by the other people. And ideally, especially if you're working with a good recruiter, you've sort of figured out who those other people are, and you've mapped out what's going to be complementary as you think about the people that you're talking to. That is pretty important.
Before we take a break, I have one more question. I'm curious because you talked about your Instagram feed. What is the best ad that has ever existed? What's your favorite? I have mine.
Well, I mean, it's a thing. You're kind of asking what's my sense of humor in a way. I would say my favorite. Well, I'm going to have to recreate it a little bit, but one of my favorite ads of all time is a UPS ad from it's a while ago. It's let's say it's from the '90s, whenever it is, and it's these two consultants are there, and they're talking to this business guy, and they're like, "All right, we can move the product. We suggest that you take the containers and you put the containers through Brussels, and you do the thing." And then eventually the CEO leans over and says, "All right, I like it. Do it." And the one consultant looks at the other, and then looks at the CEO and says,
"Sir, we don't actually do what we propose. We just propose it."
And then it flips over and says, UPS third-party logistics. We actually do it, basically, right? But it was just, such a great example of using humor in a typical business situation to nail down the positioning for the brand. Perfect. Genius.
Yeah.
I think we owe our listeners a break. I think we will have a great conversation. We will pause here and come back with more with Erik about how to become and what it's like to be a travel CEO. All right, and we are back. Part 2 of the Travel Podcast, and we are still joined, as before, with Erik Blachford, and we are talking about how to become the CEO of a travel company and what the heck a CEO even does. We've been having these great conversations about skill sets, about how you do it. Erik, I thought a fun little exercise for this, just to start us off, is maybe you can give us a little bit of executive coaching. We've talked about a lot of these ideas, but I'm sure, let's say Sarah wants to be a CEO of the next media company, or many of our listeners want to be the CEO of a travel company. We've talked about these skills. We've talked about the board hiring process. How do you become a CEO candidate?
Well, I mean, it depends on where you're starting from, of course. But one thing we haven't sort of talked about is one thing that's important as a CEO is, as we used to say, you want to be able to operate at 50 feet and at 50,000 feet. And so depending on where you are right now or somewhere in the middle, you do want to make a conscious effort to do the other. So if you're in the trenches and you're sitting there tooling away in your, let's say, a fairly early career job, and you're thinking to yourself, well, one of these days I'd like to be in the C-suite. I mean, there's first thing you have to do, of course, is just, do well in the job that you're in. I mean, that's incredible. I have to say, just as a little sidestep, it's amazing. The thing you don't do is spend all your time thinking about the job you think you deserve, right? The next job up. That's not the thing to do. What you do is you do so well at the job. Who was it who said it? Just be so good that they can't ignore you. I think it's a Steve Martin quote, actually. That's the most important thing. But in terms of going up and down the scale, if you're operating at 50 feet, my first job at Expedia, talking about a thankless job, I was the guy who had to go around the country explaining to all the car rental companies that Microsoft was coming into the travel business. It wasn't, people didn't like hearing that. It wasn't great. But it taught me a lot about how things operated right down at ground level, doing the actual contracting. But at the same time, I realized that, okay, but you have to be thinking about the industry structure, the car rental industry structure, and understanding why it was that these guys were so resistant to paying the commission that you're asking them to pay. And then you had to actually think about that in context of the hotel business and the airline business, because those commissions are changing at the same time. And, that's operating up at 50,000 feet, right? Trying to figure out how are the big trends affecting the small things that I'm trying to get done. And once you're sitting there in the C-suite, it's sort of the opposite thing. You're surrounded all the time by all these big trends, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how are those going to translate into the on the ground? And I mean, the obvious example right now would be AI, right? Where everybody's sitting there in the C-suite going, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Well, transform customer service. Well, you better actually be able to get all the way down to the level of customer service and really understand those interactions, right? So again, you might be operating at 50,000 feet, but you better be able to understand 50 feet. And you better, by the way, be the kind of CEO willing to even get in there and have a headset on for a little while, so you really understand what you're talking about.
Well, I was going to ask about the undercover boss kind of phenomenon. I mean, do you think that most CEOs understand the 50 feet? I think that there's a world of people, maybe, two online, who think that CEOs are just blowhards that don't know anything. I think there's a reality that CEOs are very hardworking. But what side of that would you come on? Do you think most CEOs really get, do you think the CEO of an average travel company understands the customer service and the contracting?
I think most CEOs who are passionate, like I was saying before, about one of the deep strands of the business, absolutely will understand all the way down to the coalface in that strand. Yes, I do, for sure. I think that everybody's got, it's not exactly blind spots, but everybody's going to have bits where the resolution is a little bit higher and a little bit lower. I would think that if you're sitting there in one of the big travel companies, be it a tour operator, or OTA. I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on whether you actually own the customer experience on the ground or not. It's pretty hard to do that job without having a pretty thoroughgoing understanding of what's actually going on. I would say that in the OTA context, you probably have a very thorough understanding of the customer experience through a screen, and you might have your experience of understanding the customer experience through the phone or through chatting with your agents. I'm going to guess here. No knowledge.
Yeah, no.
I'm going to guess that 3 years ago, that would be mostly through numbers in terms of call times, and there's a standard set of customer service numbers you're looking at, and it's almost a cost center thing. I bet now, given AI and how much everybody is talking about the potential for AI to help reduce cost, but also at what cost to the customer experience, I bet now everybody's very engaged with what's happening there, because you can't those down at the coalface decisions when you're running a big company. I mean, think about the leverage. I mean, you can do a little test somewhere and see how it goes, and then based on the results of that, you could make huge swings in your business, either to the good or, if you get it wrong, to the bad, right? And I think it's kind of instructive that we haven't, knock on wood, but we haven't seen a big, huge face plant with somebody rolling out AI customer service and travel too quickly. And I think it's because people are really paying attention to what's happening down at the ground level. So I think as a CEO, it's situational. You can't be down at the ground level with all of your customers all the time. You just can't. Your job is to make sure that the folks who are directly reporting to you, and maybe a level down from that they're doing the best that they can. But you also can't be completely divorced from that. You can't go full blowhard. It just doesn't work.
I'm curious, one thing that we haven't talked about that I kind of thought that would come up earlier is the concept of risk and like how much risk tolerance a CEO has. I would think they would need to have a lot. I'm curious what you think about that. And I'm also curious about what the difference is in your experience between kind of like career CEOs who come in and, they're hired for a job, and founder CEOs.
Oh, wow.
I guess that ties in with the risk tolerance too, because founders by their nature are incredibly, risk tolerant. At least here in the United States, they are. And so I'm just curious what you think about founders as CEOs, and how somebody, when they ultimately have the whole company kind of riding on their decisions, thinks about and analyzes risk.
So I guess I would draw a distinction, first of all, between there's the founder CEOs who are the Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Steve, the folks who start in a garage and end up with a big multi-billion-dollar company, who get a lot of the headlines because it's an incredible thing to be able to accomplish. And there aren't that many of those people, but I certainly do think that is it's a special breed. Are they more risk tolerant, or are they better at judging the level of risk? I tend to think that, especially when it comes to making big leaps forward in your business by doing things that seem to the outside world to be incredibly risky, bet the company kind of stuff. Internally, a lot of the time, how that actually works is a big flurry of activity to mitigate the risk. You don't want to be laying down big bets unless you're pretty sure you know what the outcome is going to be, and you might be doing that through research. There, of course, is some level of gut feel on a lot of these things, but less than you might think. A lot of the time, it comes down to a big insight. It comes down to a company's, I think Amazon is pretty famous for this too. It comes down to a company's ability and willingness to shoulder some defeats as they go. Like, you have to understand, you're not going to hit 100% of the shots you take. It's not going to go, right? What you are going to do is you're going to work as hard as you can to get the risk of failure down, and you're going to figure out how to mitigate that risk so that, if you're going to, let's say Expedia was going to launch a travel phone, we'd probably all go, ooh, I don't know. But let's just say they decided, like, a travel phone, that's what we're going to do. We've decided that travelers really need a dedicated device for whatever reason. I mean, 10 years ago, you could imagine sort of maybe something like that happening. What you would do is you would say, okay, well, in order to launch that in a way that we get any kind of real feedback on it, we're going to have to do it in a somewhat big way. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to do it in the way that gives us the smallest possible financial exposure. And we're going to figure out what's the least we could do to make sure that we really understand what we're doing here. Another good example, I mean, would be if you're going to launch a big new advertising campaign. I actually learned this lesson very early on. What you don't do is you don't just launch the thing and then see how the data comes back in. No, what you do is you pick a couple of test markets and you very carefully figure out how you're going to measure it. That's the first thing. Then you measure it. Then once you know, you go, boom, we're going to launch this thing. It gets covered in the outside world as, wow, this is super risky. These guys they're not advertising air anymore. Now they're only advertising hotel. Wow, it's incredible. Well, if you've already done all the testing in the test markets nobody knows about, to you, that doesn't feel like a big risk, right? You've done the work to take a lot of the risk out of it, but to the outside world, of course, it looks like a big risk. So a lot of it is the ability to mitigate risk, as opposed to being sort of risk loving people go to Vegas. They don't run big companies.
I was going to say, do you consider yourself to be a risk tolerant person? Like, do you kind of thrive on that?
So what I
Or
consider
no?
myself, I'm absolutely willing to take a bunch of budget to try things, but I
Yeah.
am very research centric. I really like saying, okay, I don't want to try a thing unless we've already figured out how we're going to know if it works or not, and I need to see the path to scaling something up as well, and then I'm willing to try stuff all day long. So I'm as long as I've figured out, I know where the losses are cut. Sure, I'll try all kinds of stuff. But in terms of being risk tolerant to the point where, I mean, you do occasionally hear people making enormous gambles. Like say, I'm unlikely to say green light, some ginormous company transformation acquisition into a completely new kind of business that I don't really understand. These Hail Mary passes do happen in business, but I'm not the guy to do stuff like that. That's not my game.
It's kind of interesting to your point where it's like a big risk at a startup is maybe betting on $100,000 of revenue, which at a big company you could easily be betting on a lot more with a new product launch. That's
Yeah, totally. And I will say just one last thing on founder CEOs is there's no question that when you're effectively working for yourself, right? I mean, because you usually have an outside stake of the company, but also you understand your customer, generally speaking, right down to the tips of your toes. And so your intuition is going to mean that things that you're doing, you're going to have an internal risk mitigation engine that's going to allow you to understand the risks, to calibrate them better than someone coming from the outside probably would. And that's true, I think, in a bunch of different contexts, but no more so than in that founder-led company. And by the way, we always think of founder-led companies thinking of the ones that explode and become really big. But actually, what's really interesting, I mean, you want to see a founder-led company where the CEO can take risks just off the top of his head. You pick a guy like Andy Levine, who runs Duvine Travel, one of the Butterfield competitors, incredible bike tour company, very high end as well. Andy, I mean, he doesn't need to do research to know whether a new trip that they launch somewhere in the world is going to fly with his customers. He just knows. And tons and tons of smaller business founder owners, CEOs, they understand this stuff cold. So again, it looks pretty risky from outside, but not to them. It's like an executive chef rolling out a new dessert. Risky on paper, but they know.
They know.
Right.
They know it tastes good. They know it's going to sell. I wanted to ask you a bit about changes in executives. We've been talking so much about founders, about CEOs, about risk taking. One of the things, you're on a board, you get to see this a lot, so you've kind of been on both sides of this, is like succession planning. There's obviously the show Succession, and it looks really complicated and really tough. I mean, what does that look like in real life? And I mean, obviously it does happen. That show is somewhat based on a real succession story. I mean, what does succession planning look like at a large company for you, or at a company you're on the board of? Like at Zillow, you just went through that transition.
Yeah, it should not look like that show. There's my great pearl of wisdom for the day. It makes great TV, but that's not. You wouldn't want to. I will say though, they perfectly captured the tone for all the people who are working there who aren't part of the family. It was just, and then way it's genius. So I've sat on a lot of comp committees, and generally speaking, that's where that comes from. You're talking about compensation and people and promotions and who's capable of doing what. Any responsible company, once you get to a certain, I would say, once you're at the point where you're big enough that you've got committees of some kind on the board, that's around when the board should start saying, okay, we need a succession plan. Now, early on, what you're going to be thinking about is really it's the hit by a truck plan. It's like, just you got to be responsible. What happens if this person gets hit by a truck? That person does. Who would step in on the next day? Would we have to recruit from outside? Is there somebody internally? Then there's some functions. I don't know how detailed you want to get on this, but there's some functions where you're going to look at, let's say, data security, for example. You're going to say, okay, that's really deep in this company. The structure is really important. It would be incredibly difficult to fly someone in from outside on any kind of quick notice. We have to have someone in the reporting structure who could take over the next day. Then there's other things in a company where it might be a little bit easier. If you had to, you could find someone from outside. So there'll be a little bit less urgency around having somebody in the direct reporting line who would be able to step in the next day. But I mean, what happens is once you get to certainly once you're at a public company, I mean, I trust you, every single person in the C-suite and a level down has an identified successor in case they leave the company or whatever happens. And that's just good governance. That's, as I said, that's part of usually your compensation committee, paying attention to that. And the smaller the company, you talk about it, but a lot of the time there's a lot of what's our succession plan? We're crossing our fingers that that person doesn't leave. I mean, we all know that to be true, right? At a certain level of company, you just can't afford to have two people in the same kind of part of the company who are both capable of doing the big job.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you just said it, like companies, unless you're maybe a big public company, are kind of bad at this succession planning. Like they don't want to do it. It's maybe uncomfortable. I don't know. Tell me why. Why do you think that or smaller companies are so hesitant to actually have a good succession plan?
I think you just said it. I think it's because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah,
And you get to the place where once it becomes a function of governance, it becomes much less comfortable much more comfortable because now it's
yeah,
part of a process.
because you have
Like,
to.
look,
Yeah,
this is something we just have to do. Everybody can look around and be like, yeah, actually, we really do have to know this. This is just being responsible people. And, okay. At smaller companies, career paths are often much less defined. It's uncomfortable even talking about the idea that somebody might leave to go do something else. Uh, Certainly, once you start talking about who might succeed the CEO, you're constantly nervous that if you talk about that in some sort of open way, that the other people who might consider themselves to be candidates will get really pissed off and they might leave. And now you've caused a
yeah.
problem by talking about a potential problem. And so all of these things conspire to keep the conversation probably less visible than it should be. I mean, I guess I've sat on enough boards now and so on that I sort of feel like, well, the drama has kind of drained out of it. I sort of feel like, no, look,
Right.
you just have to, it doesn't matter what size the company is. You really should just know what you're going to do in the case that something goes sideways. I mean, it sort of seems reasonable. But I mean, I've been at this a while, so maybe my point of view is a little different than it would have been. My 30-year-old self might have felt differently about that. I don't know.
Yeah. You just brought up compensation. In the media, we write a lot about CEO comp, and there's generally a lot of backlash about how the delta between what CEOs make and what the average worker makes. What's your take on that? Do you think CEOs get paid too much?
Well, I think that what's in the news most of the time is the public company stats for obvious
Yeah,
reasons, right? That's what ends up getting reported. And
yeah,
I don't know if CEOs get paid too much or C-suite people get paid too much. They certainly get paid a lot more relative to what everybody else in the company gets paid than when I was starting my career, and that was already at a place where people were talking about it being different from before that. So the system for pay is in place through compensation committees and compensation consultants, so that there is a sort of a grinding spiral upwards because every
hmm
CEO, as they get hired, the compensation committee wants to make sure that they're in at the appropriate level. And the appropriate level is kind of set by the folks who are already sitting in CEO jobs at comparable companies. And of course, nobody wants to feel like their CEO is not the best CEO, so their CEO probably deserves a little more. Well, so I mean, anyway, you can see
yeah.
how it goes up. I think it's much less of a thing in private companies where it's not so visible. I would say that my comment is a world in which inequality keeps on growing and growing and growing doesn't seem to have yielded terrific results. politically and societally. So I'm not sure that it's a trend that I would love to see continue. But I think right now, the way that the pay structures work, it's hard to see. It's hard to see what the thing would be that's going to mitigate that, particularly as in the tech world, where you do have an environment where, like it or not, starting with the internet, but now I think increasingly through, I think AI is going to, if anything, be more like this. You do have a concentration of ability and power and resources, and as these companies all scramble to raise hundreds of billions of dollars for training the models and the like, it's not reasonable to think that there's going to be a huge number of companies that can do that. There's going to be a small number, and the companies that raise hundreds of billions of dollars, you would kind of expect the CEOs will probably get paid a whole lot. So to some extent, the structure of our world is pushing this stuff pretty relentlessly upwards, and you just sort of hope that they do the Warren Buffett thing and give it all away.
There you go. Well, I think that is going to be our last question today. We will leave it at this. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. And
happy to chat.
For everybody listening, this is great. And for everyone out there, send us a question, podcasts@skift.com. Maybe we will answer it online. So, Eric, thank you. Everybody else, see you next week.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. See you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Skift Travel Podcast. Wherever you're listening, please make sure to subscribe. If you like what you're hearing, rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review. It really helps get the word out about us, our podcast, and make sure that we can still continue to bring it to you free of charge every week.
If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell as well. That way you'll know every time we have a new episode.